They say the air once shimmered, not with heat or light, but with weight. Each breath felt alive, dense, full of something you could almost touch. If you stood there in the Carboniferous night, your lungs would burn gently from the richness of oxygen. Every leaf seemed to glow under the filtered sun, and the forest exhaled in slow waves, a living lung stretching across a humid planet. It was a world built from breath itself, a time when the atmosphere was so thick with life that insects could grow to the size of birds, and the air carried them as easily as dreams. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And maybe tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Imagine this. It's 320 million years ago. The continents are draped in endless wetlands. Trees without flowers or leaves rise like pillars from the fog, their bark smooth, their roots sinking into black water. Ferns taller than houses form labyrinths of shadow. The air hums, not with machines, but with wings, millions of them. Dragonflies glide through the dense air like slow-moving blades of light, their wingspans wider than a hawk's. Millipedes longer than a human stretch across the forest floor, armored like ancient trains. This was the world before dinosaurs, a kingdom of insects, ruled not by strength, but by the generosity of air. Oxygen then reached levels no creature today could survive, nearly 35%. Fires burned too easily. A single spark could ignite the undergrowth into a glowing sea of embers. But that air, that overabundance, gave life a chance to grow into something mythic. The insects did not know they were giants. They simply became what the world allowed. The very chemistry of the atmosphere sculpted their lungs, their wings, their hunger. It was as though the planet itself was experimenting, playing with the limits of breath and bone. And yet, something feels uneasy in this perfection. A world so full of air must also know how to lose it. Beneath the stillness of the swamps, the planet was hiding its decay. Fallen trees, thick with resin, didn't rot. They sank into the mud and were buried, locking away their carbon. The balance was delicate. Too much oxygen above, too much silence below. For millions of years the system held. Then, quietly, something began to shift. Scientists today read the rocks like diaries. They find fossilized air bubbles trapped in ancient amber, whispering of oxygen concentrations, and they compare them to layers of ash, to traces of soot that speak of firestorms long gone. From this record, a story emerges. The air gave life, and then, slowly, it took it away. But back then, no one would have noticed. Not the dragonflies, not the towering ferns, not the crawling arthropods with armor like burnished bronze. Life was too busy breathing to understand that it was already running out of air. The dragonflies, Meganeura, ruled the upper canopy. They were hunters, floating through green vapor with eyes that shimmered like glass mosaics. Their wings caught the light like stained glass windows from some ancient cathedral, moving with a precision that would not appear again until the first birds. Beneath them, millipedes the length of pythons curled through damp corridors of moss, their hundreds of legs moving like silent clockwork. Sea scorpions lingered in the marshes, their claws slicing the dark water. Everything was oversized, slow, deliberate, as though the world moved in a thicker, slower kind of time. And yet, the silence between their movements carried something uncanny. Insects today hum, chirp, buzz, but the Carboniferous giants were mostly voiceless. Their world was humid and dense, sounds swallowed by moisture. Every movement was muffled. When a dragonfly landed, the forest didn't notice. It was a kingdom of quiet giants. And maybe that quiet is what made their fall so invisible, because somewhere deep in the mud, bacteria were evolving. For the first time in history, life learned how to eat wood. The lignin, the tough, unbreakable compound that had preserved the forests, began to rot. And with that decay came release. Carbon dioxide poured back into the atmosphere, and oxygen began to fall. Slowly, relentlessly. The planet was exhaling. The breath that had fed the giants was beginning to thin. We imagine extinctions as sudden, but most of them aren't. They creep. They whisper through the air long before they scream. For a time, the giants didn't notice. A few species even grew larger, as if trying to defy the invisible tide. But air doesn't warn you when it changes. It just stops being enough. Their flight became harder. Their muscles, once flooded with oxygen, began to tire. They laid eggs that hatched smaller and smaller bodies. The air that once lifted them now weighed them down. Some scientists argue that this was the whole story. Too little oxygen, and the giants simply couldn't breathe. But that explanation feels too neat, too merciful. Because life rarely ends for a single reason. It unravels. It's possible that the shrinking air was only one of many unseen threads. The forests were beginning to fragment. Rivers dried, swamps collapsed, and the climate began to pulse between drought and flood. Amphibians crept from the water, hungry for soft bodies. Evolution was beginning to turn the wheel, and those who had once ruled the air were no longer safe even in it. What makes this story so haunting is that we can still see its ghosts. Every breath you take carries atoms that once passed through those forests, through the bodies of those giants. The same oxygen that filled their wings now fills your lungs. And maybe, on some level, the air remembers that it was once rich enough to make creatures bigger than it should have. The Carboniferous world didn't die all at once. It just faded. One forest, one breath, one wing beat at a time. But before the silence took it completely, it left behind a record. Coal, black and shimmering. The compressed lungs of an age that had breathed too deeply. Every time we burn it, we resurrect a piece of that vanished air. The breath of the giant still lingers, waiting to be released, reminding us that even the sky has its limits. And somewhere, deep in that ancient silence, the question still echoes. If oxygen could build a world of giants once, could it ever do so again? If the Carboniferous night was a cathedral of air, then its forests were the stained glass, living mosaics through which the planet filtered its breath. Imagine walking through them. You wouldn't see sunlight in beams, but in slow-moving rivers of gold that cut through spores and mist. The trees weren't like the ones we know. They were hollow, scaled, waterlogged, and ancient beyond comprehension. Lycophytes rising 100 feet high, with roots that sank into black water and leaves that never fell. The forest wasn't a collection of trees. It was a single living organism, bound by stillness and saturation. And that stillness was the secret that made the sky breathe. Every piece of wood that fell into those swamps became immortal. There were no fungi yet to break it down, no bacteria to digest its stubborn skin. It simply sank, sealed beneath water and mud, and waited. In doing so, it trapped its carbon. Every unrotted trunk, every leaf that refused to die, was a small offering to the sky. A gift of oxygen released upward, layer by layer, until the very air grew heavy with it. It was this imbalance that gave the insects their wings. A world too rich, too generous, too full of life's own exhalation. From above, it must have seemed endless. Continents wrapped in swamps, rivers turning black with silt and decay, skies the color of copper at dusk. And beneath that canopy, Everything was in motion. Dragonflies gliding over pools, centipedes slipping like shadows, amphibians testing the air for the first time. But there was something strange about that life. It thrived, but it didn't move quickly. It grew and waited, as though time itself were thicker here. Every moment stretched, every breath drawn from air so dense it almost tasted sweet. We often think of forests as lungs, breathing for the world. But the Carboniferous forests didn't breathe. They hoarded. They collected life and sealed it away, building the coal seams we would one day burn. They gave the atmosphere its richness, but it was a kind of unsustainable generosity. The planet was storing imbalance, quietly, deeply, without realizing what would come next. Scientists who have studied these ancient swamps describe them as paradoxes. The trees grew tall not because of fertile soil, but because of constant drowning. Their roots didn't dig for water. They escaped it. The forest floor was a cemetery of fallen trunks, never decomposing, never gone. Each death became the foundation of new life. The world, in a sense, was recycling immortality, and perhaps it was too perfect, because nothing in nature stays unbroken for long. Deep in the mud, something small began to stir, unseen, unheard. Life had found a new tool. Bacteria learned to digest lignin, the armor of wood. The spell of preservation began to unravel. The oxygen that had filled the skies now had competition. The world was about to start breathing again, but this time, the exhale would not be kind. But in this part of the story, that moment hasn't arrived yet. The giants still live. The air still hums. The forests are still heavy with growth and silence. The dragonflies still hunt above fern valleys, their compound eyes reflecting the swamp light like mirrors of molten amber. They are not aware that the source of their power lies not in their wings, but in the stillness of these trees. Trees that built the sky and will one day destroy it. Fossil records show this balance frozen in time. Layers of coal alternate with thin seams of ash, marking years of quiet growth followed by brief cleansing fires. You can see it in the rock. Life and death, inhale and exhale. And through it all, the insects grew enormous, as if inhaling with the planet itself. We can almost hear it. The faint hiss of gas escaping from rotting wood, the rustle of wings in the damp air, the creak of trunks leaning over black water. Every sound muffled, swallowed, as though the earth itself were dreaming. The forests were not alive in the way ours are. They were suspended, waiting for something to change. Some scientists describe this period as the closest the planet ever came to an imbalance of life. Too much oxygen, too little decay, too much creation, not enough destruction. The system couldn't hold. But back then, there was no warning. The trees didn't stop growing. The insects didn't stop flying. The swamp simply deepened until they became tombs for their own creators. Every inch of coal buried beneath our feet is a breath from that age. Trapped sunlight, fossilized air. It is strange to think that the comfort of modern warmth, the electricity that hums through our cities, comes from their stillness. We burn the quiet they left behind. The forests gave us more than oxygen. They gave us the first hint of planetary consciousness, that the Earth was not just a place where life happened, but a system that could shift, react, and correct itself. Too much of one thing, and the world begins to tip. The air adjusts, the oceans stir, the crust responds. What seems like disaster is often only balance returning in a language too slow for us to understand. It's easy to think of the Carboniferous as a paradise, green, endless, untouched. But it wasn't peaceful. It was on the edge of something vast and inevitable. The same stillness that made it thrive was the silence before collapse. The air had become a mirror that reflected its own excess. If you could stand there, breathing that rich oxygen, you might feel euphoric, then dizzy, then faint. Your blood would flood with oxygen toxicity. Your cells would rebel. For us, that world would be poisonous. And maybe that's the quiet irony. Paradise is rarely meant to last. Those forests made the sky breathe, but they also wrote the script for their own extinction. In every system that grows too rich, there comes a moment when balance must return. And beneath their roots, in the unseen places where rot finally remembered how to happen, that moment was already awakening. But the giants above, the dragonflies, the millipedes, the slow thunder of wings, they didn't know. They flew in the golden light, unbothered by the weight of the air, unaware that their world was already beginning to decay from beneath them. And somewhere in that vast stillness, the first flames of change flickered unseen, waiting for their time to breathe. There are moments in Earth's history when change does not roar. It exhales, slowly, invisibly, a whisper through the air. No earthquakes, no comets, no sudden ash-darkened skies, only the thinning of breath. The Carboniferous world began to fade this way, softly, quietly, without an audience. At first, it was only a hint. The air felt lighter. The fires that once consumed whole forests took longer to start. The great swamps, once endless and immortal, began to fragment. Trees still rose, but fewer of them found the waterlogged peace that had preserved their kind for millions of years. And in that shift, small, invisible, atmospheric, the era of giants began to tremble. The change started where no eye could see it. In the darkness beneath the roots, the air was built by what the earth refused to rot. And now, for the first time, the earth had learned how to rot again. Microbes, silent, patient, almost invisible, discovered how to digest lignin, the shield that had kept wood immortal. It was an evolutionary whisper that rewrote the entire atmosphere. The invention of decay. It sounds like such a small thing, but it was one of the great revolutions of life, perhaps more important than flight or even thought. When those microbes learned to eat wood, they unlocked all the oxygen trapped in carbon's quiet prisons. Every fallen trunk became a chemical event, every swamp a slow exhale. Carbon dioxide began to rise again, and oxygen, that precious breath that had filled the world, began to fall. The air was changing character. It lost its thickness, its sweetness. The skies that had once carried wings as broad as windows began to resist them. The giant insects still flew, but the drag of the air was different. They had to work harder. Their muscles ached. Some fossils showed the slow reduction of wingspan, the silent arithmetic of adaptation, each generation a little smaller than the last. But it was not only the air that shifted. The rhythm of the planet itself changed. The great rainforests, stretched across what is now Europe and North America, began to fragment. Continental drift and subtle climate shifts broke them apart into islands of green separated by barren plains. Species that had once moved freely between swamps were trapped. Populations split, isolated. Evolution began to splinter its designs. Some trees tried to follow the receding water. Others withered. The swamps dried, leaving behind layers of black shale where oxygen once glowed. Insects that depended on damp air retreated deeper into shadows. Amphibians, half fish, half land creature, grew stronger lungs. The air, though thinner, became theirs, and the forest, once the quiet architect of the sky, began to burn. The abundance of oxygen made the fires unstoppable. Charred seams of fusane, fossil charcoal, tell the story in rock. Fires that swept entire continents, burning swamps to ash. Imagine that. A world breathing too deeply, setting itself alight just to remember balance. We might call it tragedy. The planet might have called it renewal. When scientists study these layers today, they see an oscillation, a rhythm of oxygen rising and falling across millions of years, like a heartbeat, or perhaps like breath. Maybe the Earth has always been alive in this way, inhaling life, exhaling death. The Carboniferous was one of its deep, luxuriant inhales. And now, the exhale had begun. Still, not everything died. Life rarely does. It adapted. Some insects learned to take refuge near the coasts, where air pressure stayed high and humidity lingered. Some grew lighter, more efficient. Others vanished, leaving only the shadows of wings impressed into stone. The giants, though, had no escape. Their size was their miracle, and their curse. The fossil record shows how quietly it happened. One layer filled with enormous dragonfly wings. The next, smaller. Then smaller still. No single event, no clear boundary line. Just the slow erasure of excess. The air had changed its mind. The same transformation reshaped the oceans. As decay accelerated, nutrients flooded the water, feeding blooms of microorganisms that consumed oxygen as they died. Vast regions of the sea turned anoxic, dead zones where even the simplest creatures suffocated. The rhythm of respiration was failing not just in the sky but beneath it. Some researchers believe this was the true beginning of the end for the Carboniferous balance, a feedback loop between land and sea. The forests released their carbon, the microbes multiplied, the air thinned, and the oceans began to choke. A chain reaction of invisible suffocation. And yet, in that collapse, something extraordinary happened. Evolution surged. New life, smaller but more complex, began to fill the gaps. The giants made space for the quick, the nimble, the adaptive. The world was learning to move faster. It's strange to think about how progress often begins in loss, how nature's creativity blooms most when old systems fail. The decline of oxygen didn't just end in age, it cleared the stage for new experiments. But if we step back and listen not as scientists but as wanderers through time, it sounds like grief. The forests falling silent, the insects losing their lift, the skies, once thick with wings, emptying. Even the fire, that bright heartbeat, left behind only ash. Imagine standing there on a day when the air first began to feel thin. You wouldn't see the difference, but you would sense it. A faint unease, a stillness that wasn't peace. The dragonflies would still hover, but their flight would seem slower, labored. The ferns would still sway, but their spores would fall to drier soil. The world was subtly holding its breath, as if unsure of what to do next. There is a strange beauty in that kind of change, the kind that doesn't announce itself. The world never truly collapses, it just forgets who it used to be. The Carboniferous was forgetting its own dream, rewriting itself one breath at a time. And beneath that dream, in the soft mud, the architects of decay were still at work, unseen, unstoppable. What they were doing seemed natural, but it was rewriting the planet's future. They were creating a world where no forest could stay immortal, no air could stay too rich, no creature could grow too large again. Every age builds its own undoing. And as the air thinned and the forest burned and the balance tilted back toward equilibrium, the question the planet seemed to whisper was simple and endless. How much life can a world bear before it needs to breathe out? The Carboniferous answered that question with silence. And in that silence, the next chapter of the Earth's long memory began. When the air began to thin, life did not end. It adapted. But in adaptation, something more subtle began to unfold. Hunger. The silence that once hung over the swamps broke not with wind or thunder, but with footsteps. Small, hesitant, damp. The first creatures to leave the water did not come for conquest. They came because the old world was disappearing beneath them. The amphibians were the first to test the boundary. Their bodies, soft and heavy, dragged across the mud like shadows learning to stand. They breathed both water and air, neither fully at home in one or the other. Their skin glistened in the half-light, tasting the air for the first time. What they found was not paradise, but opportunity. Insects, abundant and unguarded, moved through the ferns in mechanical rhythm. Wings hummed above the surface, armored bodies crept below. To these early land wanderers, it must have seemed like an endless feast. Imagine the sound of it. The faint slap of limbs on wet ground. The ripple of a primitive lung drawing its first uncertain breath. Behind that sound came something the world had not yet known. Fear. For millions of years, the insects had no natural enemy large enough to threaten them. Their size had been their freedom. But now, something new was walking. The fossil record preserves this transition like a whispered confession. Tracks frozen in ancient mud show the moment vertebrates claimed the shore. Tiny drag marks beside them, trails of insects, and abruptly. The story writes itself. The predator had found its prey. It wasn't violent, not yet. It was more like an exchange. A quiet biological transaction that would change the balance of power forever. And yet, this wasn't a war fought in noise or blood. It was fought in stillness. The amphibians grew stronger lungs. The reptiles that followed them shed the need for water entirely. They carried the air within their bodies, sealed from the swamps that had birthed them. With each adaptation, the insect's kingdom shrank. The age of breath was becoming the age of jaws. In that new silence, evolution began to rewrite the rules. The dragonflies still hovered above, but they were no longer alone. Below them, something with eyes, with hunger, was watching. In the water, sleek shadows waited to lunge. On land, small reptiles stalked the forest floor, their movements jerky but determined. Every breath of the giants was now a risk. To breathe was to be seen. What had once been abundance now became vulnerability. The giants, slow to change, carried their own undoing on their backs. Their size, once the gift of oxygen, became a burden in a world of predators. They could not hide. Their flight, designed for thick air, made them clumsy in the new sky. They could still soar, but not escape. Some scientists argue this was the true turning point. Not oxygen, not microbes, but competition. The first vertebrate hunters rewrote evolution's tempo. A new kind of intelligence was rising, not conscious, not yet, but strategic. The amphibians learned to wait. The reptiles learned to stalk. And for the first time, the insects became the hunted. There's something poetic in that shift. The small reclaiming dominion from the enormous, the quiet over the loud. The insects had ruled by excess, by the generosity of air. But air cannot protect against teeth. The predators didn't just eat, they reshaped. They forced evolution to adapt towards subtlety, speed, and concealment. Even the landscape reflected this tension. The once continuous swamps broke apart, leaving islands of life surrounded by wastelands. In these fragmented habitats, predators and prey danced in isolation, each world developing its own rules. Fossils from these regions show diversity blooming like cracks in glass. Thousands of variations, most doomed, some enduring. The forest itself seemed to conspire with the new order. The dense canopy cast deep shadows. The light, once even and golden, now broke into stripes. It was harder to see, easier to ambush. For the first time, The stillness of the Carboniferous night became dangerous. Every movement meant exposure. The insects, unable to think but somehow aware, shifted their behavior. They became more nocturnal, more cautious. Their world, once a paradise of air, had become a labyrinth of eyes. Still, the balance held, for a while. The predators were small, the prey still many. But in evolution, size is never neutral. The amphibians grew, their jaws widening, their limbs strengthening. The reptiles grew scales and independence, carrying the heat of the sun within them. Insects remained trapped by their design, breathing through tiny spiracles, limited by diffusion. No matter how rich the air, there was a ceiling they could not surpass. And now, that ceiling pressed down harder. In this quiet war, the forests became graveyards. Fossils tell of incomplete meals, wings scattered across mudstone, mandibles fused in struggle. Some dragonflies survived by sheer persistence. Others vanished, leaving behind only the echo of their flight in rock. It's easy to see this through human eyes, as tragedy, as loss. But perhaps it was simply the planet correcting its equation again. For millions of years, insects had lived unchallenged, untested. Their size was an indulgence, their stillness a luxury. Predators brought tension, and tension brings change. Without it, evolution stagnates. Somewhere between the fading swamps and the rising reptiles, the Carboniferous world ended. The line between land and water blurred, and in that blur, something new was born. Competition. The world no longer belonged to the air, but to movement. To breath that hunted breath. The insects, though diminished, endured. They found safety in numbers, in speed, in smallness. And the predators, primitive, uncertain, grew sharper, leaner, more precise. The war between air and flesh had begun. But as the insects shrank and the reptiles spread, another transformation was stirring far beyond their awareness. Beneath the land, deep within the crust, the planet itself was preparing its next act. The air was still shifting. The fires had not yet burned their last. The balance, so carefully rebuilt, was about to fracture again. For now, though, the night belonged to the hunters. The air, once a sanctuary, had become a stage. And through it all, the world kept breathing, slower, thinner, colder. The giants were still alive, but the sound of their wings no longer filled the sky. It was fading into something smaller, sharper, more fragile. Perhaps that is how every age ends. Not with silence, but with footsteps in the mud, following the echo of wings that no longer rise. There is a kind of silence that follows the end of an age. It isn't the absence of sound, but the weight of everything that no longer speaks. That silence fell upon the Carboniferous forests. For millions of years, they had been the breath of the planet, feeding it, cooling it, balancing its rhythms. But nothing in nature breathes forever. It began quietly, as endings often do. Rain became uncertain. Rivers withdrew. The once endless swamps began to shrink into scattered wetlands surrounded by dry plains. The ground cracked where it used to shimmer. Trees that had never known drought stood exposed beneath a harder sun. Without water, their roots lost the slow, suffocating peace that had kept them immortal. The forest started to remember what it meant to die. Scientists call this the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. But the phrase feels too sterile for what truly happened. It wasn't only the loss of trees. It was the unraveling of an entire planetary system. The continents themselves were moving, colliding to form the great supercontinent Pangaea. Mountains rose, winds shifted, and monsoon patterns changed. Air currents that once brought steady rain began to falter. The humidity that had wrapped the world in green turned to dust. Imagine walking through that dying forest. The ferns still stood, but their edges browned. The air, once thick enough to feel, began to thin. The smell of rot was new, sharp, unfamiliar. Each fallen trunk decomposed faster than before, releasing the carbon that had been trapped for ages. Oxygen levels dipped, fraction by fraction, while carbon dioxide crept upward. The balance that had fed the giants was gone, and the sky was learning how to forget them. The collapse didn't happen in a single generation. It unfolded like a slow breath leaving the lungs. The forests withdrew north and south, following the remaining moisture. Between them stretched barren belts of heat. Swamps turned to shallow pools, then to cracked mud, then to nothing. The great amphibians followed the retreating waters, while the early reptiles, creatures of drought and resilience, spread into the emptiness. Life was reorganizing itself under a new climate, one that would no longer favor wings and damp lungs. The evidence remains in stone. Thick seams of coal that end abruptly, followed by sandstones and red beds, sediments of deserts where forests once stood. Geologists trace this boundary across continents, a scar visible from North America to Europe to China. Beneath it lies the world of the giants. Above it, a leaner, harsher earth. The coal forests had given the planet its breath, and now their burial gave it a fever. What died with them was more than vegetation. It was the architecture of an atmosphere. Without the endless swamps to trap carbon, decomposition flooded the sky with CO2. Oxygen fell, fires waned, and the great insects, those delicate machines built for abundance, could no longer sustain their vast bodies. Some lingered in the last remaining wetlands, flickering like ghosts above stagnant pools. Others dwindled into forms small enough to survive the new air. Evolution was rewriting the blueprint of survival, line by line. If you listen closely to the geological record, you can almost hear it. The transition from chorus to whisper. The dense hum of wings gives way to the dry rattle of leaves. The chorus of frogs fades, replaced by the crackle of wind through hollow trunks. It is as though the planet itself was closing its throat, conserving what breath it had left. Some scientists believe volcanic activity deepened the crisis. As Pangaea rose, so did new volcanic arcs, exhaling gases that thickened the atmosphere and warmed the planet. Others argue that the newly evolved microbes, now feasting on lignin, released enough carbon to tilt the balance alone. The cause hardly matters. The result was the same. The age of abundance became the age of scarcity. There's something almost human in the way the forest died. It had given too much, too long. It had fed the sky, cooled the sea, built a paradise for things that could never understand the cost. And when that generosity finally failed, the world did not mourn. It adapted. Insects, once emperors of the air, retreated into specialization. They shrank, split, diversified. Some became scavengers, others pollinators. They learned to survive on less, to breathe in thinner air. The giants, whose wings had cast shadows on the swamps, became myth. Memories pressed into rock. Each fossilized wing is a moment of resistance, a gesture against the shrinking of the world. For the reptiles, it was the opposite. They thrived in the ruin. Freed from water, they carried the forest's extinction like a torch. Their dry skin protected them from the heat. Their lungs worked in the thin air. They multiplied across the new deserts, shaping a future that would no longer belong to the air breathers of old. In their rise, the world discovered a new way to live, not through abundance, but through endurance. Sometimes, when paleontologists study these layers under microscopes, they find thin traces of ash woven between the coal. Fire had visited the forests near their end, perhaps sparked by lightning, perhaps by oxygen itself. It is almost symbolic. The world that once exhaled too deeply ended by burning. Every flame was the forest returning to the sky, molecule by molecule. We often think of extinction as absence, but what the coal forest left behind was presence. Carbon seams so vast they still shape our age. When we dig them up and burn them, we are breathing in that ancient air again, resurrecting the very imbalance that ended it. The ghosts of those trees warm our nights and power our cities, still giving, still collapsing over and over. What the earth learned in that long dying was balance. Life could no longer afford to lean toward one extreme. Too much oxygen and fire devours it. Too little, and breath fades. The forests had been the world's great experiment in generosity, and generosity had nearly killed it. So the planet adjusted. The oxygen level fell toward stability. The giants disappeared into myth. The new world was leaner, hungrier, quieter. But in that quiet, something enduring began. The air that had once carried the sound of dragonfly wings now carried something different. The rustle of scales, the scrape of claws, the low hiss of creatures that would come to rule. The Carboniferous ended not with catastrophe, but with transformation. A slow turning of the breath, an exhalation that lasted 10 million years. The sky had been too full. Now, it was learning how to rest, and in that rest, the stage was clearing. The next chapter of life, the one written in ash, in bone, in silence, was waiting for its cue, because the planet had not yet finished changing. Beneath the cooling crust, pressure was building. The earth, like a lung between breaths, was preparing to inhale again. Every few 100 million years, the earth seems to take a breath. Not a metaphor, but a literal exchange. Oxygen rising, carbon falling, air thickening, then thinning again. The pulse is slow, but steady, written into stone and ice, in the ratios of gases trapped in bubbles of time. The Carboniferous, with all its lush excess, was one of the planet's great inhalations. And the silence that followed, the drying forests, the thinning air, the shrinking wings, was the long exhale. We live on a breathing world, though we rarely think of it that way. The planet inhales through its forests, through oceans, through the shells of creatures that lock away carbon. It exhales through volcanoes, through fires, through the decay of everything that once lived. But this rhythm is not always gentle. Sometimes it is broken by imbalance. And when it is, the earth changes form. After the collapse of the coal forests, the balance that had sustained abundance was gone. The oxygen curve, the line scientists now trace across ancient epochs, fell steadily, slipping from its Carboniferous high towards something closer to today's air. With every fraction lost, the world shifted tone. The fires grew rarer. The sky cleared. The humidity retreated. Insects that had once relied on thick air now fluttered weakly, struggling in an atmosphere that no longer favored them. But in the thinning of one form of life, another found space to breathe. The reptiles, whose dry lungs thrived in the changing air, spread quickly. Amphibians dwindled, confined to the shrinking wetlands. The earth, as if correcting itself, began redistributing breath. The old world of stillness and moisture had given way to one of motion and dust. When we read the story through rocks, it feels mechanical. Percentages, carbon ratios, isotopic shifts. But if we listen to it as the earth might tell it, it's more like a sigh. Too much breath held too long, finally released. The planet, for a moment, was remembering how to breathe on its own. Oxygen, for all its life-giving power, is a dangerous companion. Too much, and the air becomes volatile, combustible, hungry for flame, too little, and metabolism collapses, suffocation disguised as stillness. The Carboniferous had lived on a knife's edge between the two, and now, in the Permian, the pendulum swung back toward restraint. The Earth was learning moderation the way all living things do, through loss. Imagine it, a world where the very act of breathing could set the sky on fire. Lightning striking a dry fern canopy could ignite whole continents. Fossilized layers of charcoal record this truth. The fire horizon of the late Carboniferous. The air itself had become unstable, as though life had exhaled too deeply. When the oxygen fell, those fires dimmed. The forests that survived no longer fed the sky so recklessly. The flames faded. The rain returned. For a while, balance was restored, but the planet's metabolism never truly rests. Beneath the crust, magma churned, cycling the gases of the deep earth upward. Volcanoes exhaled their own kind of breath, carbon-rich, slow, relentless. Each eruption was a punctuation in the planet's respiration, a reminder that the balance between air and rock was always temporary. Some scientists call this planetary breathing the Great Oxygenation Cycle, a pattern stretching back billions of years. The first great inhale occurred when cyanobacteria learned photosynthesis, flooding the world with oxygen and poisoning the organisms that had come before. The second, slower one came with the rise of forests, which pushed oxygen to record highs. Each cycle ended in collapse. Each breath, however generous, required an exhale. The Carboniferous was merely the latest example of a truth older than life itself. The earth does not hold its breath for anyone. If you stood on the shore of one of those drying swamps, you might have felt the change without understanding it. The air, once heavy and wet, would sting your lungs with dryness. The insects would still hum, but softer, farther apart. The sky, paler, thinner, would lose its shimmer. It would feel as though the world were tired of being full. In that exhaustion, evolution took a new direction. No longer rewarded for largeness, life turned inward. Creatures grew tougher, smaller, more efficient. The lush sprawl of the Carboniferous narrowed into precision. What was lost in grandeur was gained in endurance. The earth, it seemed, was sculpting resilience out of scarcity, and perhaps there's something humbling in that rhythm. Every civilization, every forest, every species believes its abundance is eternal. But the planet remembers otherwise. It has always known how to pull back, how to purge excess, how to rewrite its rules. We call these moments extinctions. The Earth might simply call them corrections. We can still trace those corrections today. In the chemistry of our air, the swing continues. Oxygen now hovers near 21%, a balance that seems stable but is always in motion. Even a shift of 1% can change everything. Fire frequency, metabolism, biodiversity. The world breathes still, slower perhaps, but never still. When geologists plot these cycles on graphs, the line moves like a heartbeat, spiking, falling, pausing. The Carboniferous spike stands tall, a monument to excess. Then, the slow, graceful descent, millions of years of exhalation. The Permian sits just below it, calm but deceptive. The inhale that would one day precede catastrophe. Because the Earth's next breath would not be gentle, what's extraordinary is how much memory the planet holds in silence. Every rock, every fossilized bubble of air is a record of breathing. A dragonfly wing preserved in shale still carries the trace of an atmosphere that no longer exists. A lump of coal still releases the sigh of a forest long vanished. Each tells the same story in a different language. Nothing stays full forever, and maybe that's why the air feels so fragile now. Because we are living inside one of the pauses, between breaths. The planet's lungs are vast, but not infinite. It inhales forests, exhales deserts, inhales ice, exhales fire. Every living thing is caught somewhere in that rhythm, borrowing its moment of oxygen, giving it back in time. The Carboniferous taught the Earth how to breathe too much. The ages that followed taught it how to breathe less. But every correction comes with a cost. Life changes shape, memory erodes, balance teeters. It's a lesson written in the air itself, one that can't be read without breathing it in. If you close your eyes and listen long enough, you might hear it. The faint pulse beneath the noise of time, the slow inhale of continents, the soft exhale of oceans, the quiet murmur of stone remembering fire. The same rhythm that once carried dragonflies the size of birds still moves through you now. You are breathing the planet's great breath, shared by every creature that ever learned to rise, to fall, to adapt. And somewhere deep below your feet, where magma turns and continents drift, the next breath is already gathering, waiting, patient, inevitable. Because the Earth, like all living things, never stops trying to remember itself. There was a time when the air itself burned. Not the way it does in feverish dreams or under the hands of war, but in the quiet, indifferent way that nature balances its debts. Oxygen, once the generous gift of forests, had become too abundant, too volatile. It waited only for a spark. When lightning fell upon the Carboniferous canopy, entire continents ignited. Flames devoured the world's green cathedrals, and the sky darkened with its own reflection. The evidence still lingers in the rocks. Thin layers of charcoal, fusane, lie buried between seams of coal, silent black signatures of ancient firestorms. Scientists call this the fire horizon, a boundary that marks the age when breathing itself became dangerous. Oxygen levels, near 35%, made combustion nearly effortless. Even damp leaves could burn. The planet, in its abundance, had created the conditions for its own cleansing. Imagine standing there in that moment. The air would taste metallic, sharp, almost electric. The wind, hot and alive, carrying the scent of resin and carbon. Ferns would burst like paper, releasing clouds of spores that glowed in the firelight. Dragonflies, confused and dazzled, would rise in swarms, their wings catching sparks as they fled toward an orange horizon. Every gust of air fed the inferno. Every breath was a risk. To the insects, this was not catastrophe. Fire was simply another kind of weather, unpredictable but temporary. They would return when the ash cooled, when the smoke became fog again. But for the forests, each blaze was a wound. With every fire, more carbon was released. With every wound, the sky grew heavier, then thinner. What had once been the lungs of the earth became its fever. And yet, even in this destruction, there was pattern. The planet seemed to burn in rhythm, as if exhaling in flames. Layers of charcoal alternate with untouched soil in fossil records, evidence of cycles of burning and rebirth that spanned thousands of years. Fire became not an ending, but a breath. Some scientists believe these ancient fires were essential to life's next transformation. By thinning the forests, they made room for new kinds of vegetation. Plants with thicker bark, smaller leaves, deeper roots. Evolution responded to flame by hardening itself. The same fires that ended one world ignited another. Still, the cost was immense. The great coal forests could not endure endless burning. They retreated, fragmented, and finally collapsed. The immense oxygen that once made the air heavy now turned against its creators. For a while, even the atmosphere itself seemed unstable. The fires consumed oxygen faster than the surviving plants could replace it. Gradually, the air lost its richness. The balance shifted again, as if the planet had tired of its own excess. Insects, those masters of adaptation, were caught in the middle of this slow catastrophe. They had been born of oxygen, raised by stillness, crowned by air. Now they lived in a world of fire and drought. Their wings still shimmered, but their reach was smaller. Their flight, once effortless, required more strength. The very sky that had carried them now pushed back. When the flames receded, the world was unrecognizable. Where there had been forests, there were plains of ash. Where there had been swamps, there were shallow basins of blackened mud. The once green horizon was gray and skeletal. The light filtering through the smoke had turned copper, the color of dying suns. And in that strange, quiet glow, the earth seemed to pause, as if listening to its own heartbeat. Perhaps it was here, in this crucible of fire and silence, that the idea of balance was born. The planet had learned that too much air could be as lethal as too little, that creation and destruction were not opposites but partners. Fire had written that truth across continents, in lines of ash and coal. For millions of years after, the earth would carry the memory of those fires. It still does. Every spark, every forest blaze, every ember carried by the wind is a repetition of that first lesson. The air remembers what it can do. Some paleobotanists have found fossilized tree trunks from this era with bark vitrified by heat. The trees did not burn away completely. They were turned into glass. Their forms, frozen mid-combustion, reveal a world where destruction could be strangely beautiful. The same chemical forces that powered the flames would one day power metabolism, breathing, even thought. Fire, in a way, was the first intelligence of the planet, a reminder that life is always in conversation with what can end it. If you listen to charcoal, it speaks softly of that age. Under magnification, its structure is perfect, a lace of cellular ghosts, every pore preserved. It is wood turned into memory, the imprint of breath turned into silence. Each grain is an echo of a forest that once built the sky and then watched it burn. And yet, fire did not erase everything. Some seeds survived in the ash, waiting for rain. When the storms finally came, they fell for weeks, maybe months, washing carbon into rivers, carrying life into the sea. From that soot-fed ocean would rise new ecosystems, new chains of life. The breath that fire took away, water returned. The cycle continued, slower, deeper, wiser. In this, the earth revealed its character, not cruel, not kind, but cyclical. It gives until it must take back. The fires were its exhale, the rain its inhale. Between them, balance was rewritten. Today, when wildfires sweep through modern forests, they are distant echoes of that ancient pulse. The chemistry is the same, the breath identical, though our species tends to forget its place in the rhythm. We treat fire as invasion, when in truth it is memory resurfacing. For the insects that survived, the world was smaller now, but cleaner. Less air, fewer flames, colder nights. They adapted again. They always do. Their resilience is the most honest part of the story. They are both fragile and indestructible. Even when the skies burned, they found a way to hide, to wait, to begin again. The fire horizon was not merely a line in stone. It was a reminder that even air has limits, that the sky itself can turn predator. When oxygen became too ambitious, the earth reminded it of proportion. The lesson burned into the planet's crust still hums beneath our feet, and perhaps that's what balance really means. Not peace, but the ability to begin again after fire. The forests burned, the giants fell, and the world exhaled. Then, In the quiet that followed, new life listened to the smoke and learned how to breathe differently, because even destruction, when seen from deep enough time, is just another form of rhythm. The same rhythm that turns forests into coal, coal into energy, energy into memory. A rhythm that still moves through us, through every breath, through every spark that flickers against the dark. Even as the forests burned, another fire was waking, deeper, older, and far more patient. It began beneath the crust, in places where no root could reach, where pressure built for ages and silence was measured in magma. The world above thought the crisis was its own. Too much oxygen, too many flames. But the earth below was already preparing a different correction. For while the forests exhaled their last breath, the planet's molten heart was preparing to speak. At first, there would have been tremors, faint, long, almost imperceptible. The land, already dry from the collapse of the swamps, shivered. Rivers changed course. The air smelled faintly of sulfur, though no one was alive to name it. And then, somewhere on the other side of the world, the ground cracked open. Volcanoes rose like wounds through the skin of continents. Great plumes of gas escaped. Carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur dioxide. The breath of the deep earth, heavy and invisible. It drifted across oceans and forests, mixing with the thinning oxygen above. To those who might have survived, it would have been a sky turned strange. Redder sunsets, thicker dawns, rain that tasted like metal. This was not the end of the world. Not yet. It was only the beginning of a longer unraveling, the quiet link between the dying forests and the poisoned air. What burned above was now echoed by what boiled below. For the first time, the planet's two breaths, biological and geological, collided. The Carboniferous had been an age of surface life, of air and plant and wing. But this next shift came from within. The crust itself began to move differently. Continents gathered, pushing together to form the supercontinent Pangaea, a single vast landmass where once there had been many. It was a slow collision, millions of years long, but it remade everything. Ocean currents shifted, winds reversed, climates hardened. Deserts spread across the interior like cracks on glass. The sky once generous turned severe, and through it all, the volcanoes kept breathing. Some were small, regional eruptions that filled valleys with ash. Others were vast enough to darken the horizon for months, even years. The planet's atmosphere thickened with dust and gas, blocking sunlight, cooling the world, and then, paradoxically, heating it again as carbon built up. The rhythm of breathing had turned chaotic. Inhale and exhale tangled in confusion. The insects that had survived the forest fires found this new world alien. The air was thinner now, not just from loss of oxygen, but from contamination. The delicate tracheal systems that once drew life so effortlessly now struggled to filter poison. Some species vanished entirely, their fossils stopping abruptly in the record. Others adapted. Smaller wings, tougher shells, faster life cycles. Survival had become a kind of shrinking, and yet, the Earth was not cruel. It was simply indifferent. The eruptions, catastrophic as they were, served a purpose. The gases they released rebalanced what the forest had oversupplied. Too much oxygen had turned the sky volatile. Too much carbon now made it warm. Between the two, the planet found its rhythm again. Painful, imperfect, alive. Scientists studying these events in our time find their fingerprints everywhere. In mineral grains, in isotopic signatures, in tiny glass bubbles trapped within ancient lava flows. Each one tells the same story. The surface and the deep earth are never separate. The lungs of the planet may be trees and algae, but its heartbeat is fire. Imagine the sight. Endless plains of volcanic glass, rivers of molten rock cutting through the ruins of forests, ash falling like slow snow, muffling what little sound remained. The insects would have flown low, near water, away from the heat. The reptiles would have burrowed. The amphibians, once rulers of the shallows, would have suffocated as their ponds filled with acid rain. Above them, the sky glowed strange, copper by day, violet by night. The sun, dimmed by haze, looked tired, almost sick. The air was thick with carbon and dust, yet colder than before. The world had entered a paradox, burning and freezing, suffocating and gasping, both at once. This was not a single eruption. It was a chorus. Hundreds, maybe thousands of volcanoes whispering together across the supercontinent. Some rose from deep fissures, others from mountain arcs born of collision. It was as though the planet itself had found a new way to exhale, to rid itself of the pressure it had held since the last age. And from this exhale came a long, slow transformation. The high oxygen atmosphere of the Carboniferous gave way to the more measured mix of the Permian. The firestorms faded, the air cleared, and new ecosystems began to form. Plants smaller, tougher, built for drought. Insects lean and fast, no longer giants but survivors. Reptiles spreading across the dry plains, their eggs hardened against desiccation. If the Carboniferous was a dream of abundance, the Permian was an awakening. The planet had shifted from generosity to restraint, from lushness to endurance. Everything that lived learned to need less. And yet, the memory of fire remained. The earth never truly forgets its own lessons. Deep in the mantle, under the scars of the last eruptions, more pressure was gathering. The planet's breathing was not finished. Scientists today can trace the rhythm. The Carboniferous oxygen peak, the slow decline, the coal forest collapse, the great exhalation of volcanoes, and then, millions of years later, the greatest extinction the world would ever know. The Permian Triassic event, when over 90% of life vanished. The stage for that disaster was built here, in these fires, in this quiet rearrangement of the air. The seeds of catastrophe are always planted in balance, and perhaps that's the most haunting part of it. How natural it all was. The world didn't die because it was broken. It died because it was breathing. Too deeply, too rhythmically, too well. The same cycles that gave birth to life are the ones that end it. The volcanoes of that age still sleep beneath our continents. Their remnants lie buried in Siberia, China, Australia, scars hidden beneath time. But their gases still shape the chemistry of our world. The carbon that heated those ancient skies never truly vanished. It merely transformed, settled, waited. And as we breathe today, as our fires burn forests, as our machines exhale carbon into the air, we are, in a way, part of the same rhythm. The same planetary respiration that once ended the age of giants. The same slow, inevitable pulse. Beneath every forest, beneath every ocean, beneath every city, the volcanoes still turn, waiting for the next exhale, because the Earth's breath is endless, and even when it burns, it is still, somehow, alive. Long after the last fires dimmed and the sky found its quieter balance, the ghosts of the Carboniferous stirred once more. The air, though thinner now, was still kind enough to allow small miracles. Across the early Permian world, in scattered valleys of green and pools left behind by retreating swamps, the great insects tried to rise again. Their wings spread in fragile defiance against the new order of drought and dust. It was the briefest of resurrections, the earth inhaling, just a little before its next long silence. In the fossil record, this moment appears as an echo, not a full return, but a shimmer of memory. dragonflies with wingspans still near 2 feet, millipedes long as serpents, though fewer, slower, weary. They moved through a world that no longer belonged to them, like survivors wandering the ruins of a forgotten empire. The air they breathed was different now. Oxygen had fallen to near 25%, enough to sustain, but not to empower. The sky that once lifted them effortlessly now offered resistance. Each wing beat was work. The pressure that had buoyed their ancestors had weakened. The giants could fly, but only for a while. Their dominance was measured not in eternity, but in moments. Still, life is stubborn. Even in decline, it seeks return. These giant insects adapted as best they could. They grew lighter frames, finer wings, faster reflexes. Some species evolved lungs more efficient at drawing oxygen through the narrowing air. Others shortened their life cycles, blooming quickly and vanishing before drought or cold could take them. Evolution was improvising, rewriting the music of survival on the same ancient instrument. The forests, too, had changed their tune. Gone were the vast coal swamps of stillness. In their place stood forests of seed-bearing trees, ancestors of pines and cycads, their roots clinging to dry soil. The new world was harder, sharper, less forgiving. The insects that survived learned to live among needles and cones instead of ferns and moss. The gentle green of the Carboniferous had been replaced by a more angular beauty, the architecture of endurance, and yet, something in the air remembered. Oxygen levels, though never reaching their old extremes, fluctuated again. Tiny increases, subtle and temporary, allowed bursts of gigantism to reappear. Here and there, the fossils record them. Dragonflies nearly as large as their Carboniferous ancestors, emerging millions of years after their kind had vanished. They are anomalies, but meaningful ones. Whispers that the old potential had not entirely died. Scientists studying these fossils see patterns. The return of giant species whenever oxygen briefly rose, followed by their disappearance as it fell. It is as if the world itself was experimenting, testing the limits of breath. Could the giants come back, if given air enough? The answer, written in rock, seems to be no, at least not for long. The new Earth had other plans, because while oxygen rose and fell, another transformation was underway above them. The first vertebrates had begun to take the skies. In that fragile interlude of balance, the ancestors of birds were stirring, small reptilian creatures testing the air with gliding membranes and feathery fringes. It would take millions of years for them to perfect flight, but even their beginnings were enough to change the equation. Predation from above altered everything. The air, once safe, became contested ground. The insects that tried to grow large again found themselves hunted. Big bodies were too easy to see, too slow to hide. Survival now favored smallness, agility, stealth, invisibility. The very laws of the sky were rewriting themselves in feathers and bone. The fossils that record this shift are strange and bittersweet. Large-winged dragonflies appear in one layer, then vanish in the next, replaced by smaller, nimbler cousins. It is the same story told again and again across eras. The world gives, then takes away. What was once possible becomes myth. If you look closely, though, you'll see that the story of these brief returns is not tragedy, but continuity. The giants did not die in vain. They handed their design forward. The modern dragonfly, small, precise, impossibly agile, is the perfected echo of its colossal ancestor. Its compound eyes, its wing structure, its flight control, all are refinements of a blueprint first drawn in the Carboniferous. The body shrank. The idea remained. This, too, is the nature of the Earth's breathing. It never truly destroys. It transforms. Each exhale scatters the memory of the last inhale into a new shape. The Permian insects were not ghosts of the past, but messengers of persistence. They carried in their tiny frames the proof that life always finds a form to fit the air it's given. The return of the giants, brief as it was, also shows how delicate that balance remains. The difference between abundance and collapse is measured in fractions. A few degrees of heat, a few breaths of air, a single evolutionary leap. The Earth does not need violence to change. It needs only to breathe slightly differently. And somewhere in that understanding lies the quiet ache of the story. These insects, relics of a bygone atmosphere, tried to live again. And for a fleeting moment, they succeeded. They rose on trembling wings into skies that had once belonged to them. For a heartbeat of geological time, the world remembered what it had been. But memory fades, even in stone. The brief return ended as the air grew thinner again. The giants shrank for the last time. The forest grew sparse, the swamps turned to plains, and the age of insects gave way to the age of reptiles. The sky, once heavy with wings, now echoed with nothing but the whisper of wind over dust. Still, if you stand in a summer field today and watch a dragonfly hover in a shaft of light, you're seeing that ancient defiance, that refusal to vanish. Each tiny flick of its wings is a relic of that age when the earth itself was larger, slower, more generous. Its ancestors once ruled the air in silence. Now they rule in miniature, and perhaps that's how the planet chooses to remember. Not through monuments, but through echoes. The giants are gone, but the idea of them remains, coded into the flight of every small, persistent thing that still rises toward the sun. The brief return of the ancient insects wasn't a mistake. It was a rehearsal, a last, graceful breath before the next inhale of evolution. And even though that breath was short, it left something behind. A reminder that life never stops trying, even when the sky itself forgets how to lift it. Because in every age that follows collapse, there is always something that dares to fly again. Even when the air has changed, even when the world has forgotten, there's always a creature somewhere beating its wings against extinction, and for a moment, winning. When the last of the giant insects folded its wings, the sky fell quiet, but not for long. From the bones of reptiles, the next claimants to the air began to form. It started with glides, small, leathery membranes stretched between ribs and claws, creatures leaping from trees to chase prey or escape it. They did not yet fly, but they dreamed of it. And those dreams would eventually write the next great chapter in the story of air. Millions of years after the fall of the Carboniferous giants during the late Jurassic, the world's skies belonged to new rulers. Creatures of bone, feather, and intent, the first birds. Archaeopteryx, the name most whispered in stone, stood between worlds, reptile and bird, scale and feather, ground and sky. It wasn't graceful, not yet, but it was enough. The air, once the domain of insects, had found new masters. For the giants that remained, this change was irreversible. Flight was no longer just a gift of the air. It had become a battlefield. Every advantage insects once held, lightness, speed, maneuverability, was being mirrored by vertebrates that could think, hunt, and learn. The very design of the sky was changing. The first birds were predators of a kind the world had never seen. Agile, warm-blooded, driven by metabolism that demanded constant movement. They hunted not by chance but by intention, using vision and instinct sharpened by hunger. To a dragonfly, once a monarch of still air, the flutter of feathers must have felt like prophecy. the sky rewriting itself in real time. And yet, evolution did not rest there. While the birds claimed the day, the night prepared its own hunters. Bats, those quiet, impossible mammals, emerged millions of years later, filling the darkness with sonar and silent wings. They could fly without light, feed without sight, hunt without mercy. The air was now divided, day to the birds, night to the bats. There was no hour left for the insects to call their own. The rise of these predators did something subtle but final to the legacy of the giants. Even when oxygen levels rose again, even when the world briefly offered the chemistry that had once made them possible, no insect grew large again. The physics allowed it. The atmosphere permitted it. But the ecology refused. The sky was already occupied. Some scientists describe this as the predation ceiling, the idea that size is not limited by what air can hold, but by what hunts within it. Large bodies are easy targets. Small ones can hide. Evolution, ever practical, chose discretion over grandeur. The insects shrank, not because they had to, but because the world no longer rewarded their size. It is humbling to realize that even abundance cannot resurrect what no longer belongs. The oxygen-rich atmosphere that once created the giants returned briefly during the Cretaceous. Yet not a single insect regained its former scale. The air was filled with predators too skilled, too many, too fast. The sky itself had become a cage, and so the descendants of the Carboniferous titans lived on, miniaturized but multiplied. Their power was no longer in dominance, but in persistence. There would be no single monarch of the air now, only millions of small, perfect survivors. The age of individuals was over. The age of swarms had begun. From a distance, it might have looked like balance. The birds wheeled above, the bats fluttered in darkness, and the insects filled every remaining breath between them. The air became an ecosystem in itself, a living web of motion and sound. Yet behind that beauty lay a quiet truth. Evolution had shut one door and opened another. The era of giants had given way to an age of hierarchy, but there is another way to see it. Perhaps the earth was not cruel in taking the skies from the insects. Perhaps it was merciful. Gigantism had been born of imbalance, a world too rich in air, too indulgent in growth. What replaced it was efficiency, grace, intelligence. Wings that didn't simply move with the wind, but understood it. The sky, like the planet beneath it, was learning refinement. When paleontologists uncover the feathered fossils of early birds, they often find them beside insect wings, crushed together in the same layers of stone. Prey and predator turn to memory in the same instant. The insects still glitter in the shale, iridescent, as if they never truly died. The feathers, soft as dust, outline a body frozen mid-flight. The story of competition, captured in silence. And yet, there is something strangely peaceful about that image. The old and the new sharing the same grave. The wings that once ruled the world now lying beside the wings that replaced them. It is the nature of air to belong to whoever can use it best. And the insects, having taught the world how to fly, stepped back. The sky itself changed character with its new inhabitants. Where dragonflies once hovered in silence, the air now pulsed with song. Feathers brushed against wind, beating hearts echoed through thermals, calls traveled for miles. The sky had found its voice. It was no longer the quiet cathedral of the Carboniferous. It had become a symphony. Still, if you could listen closely, beneath the calls of birds and the whispers of bats, you might hear a thinner, older sound, the soft hum of small wings, persistent, eternal. The insects never left. They simply accepted their new shape in the hierarchy of breath. Some of their descendants adapted even further, weaving themselves into the new order. Pollination, mimicry, camouflage. Strategies born not from power, but from subtlety. They became the architects of ecosystems, invisible yet indispensable. Their defeat became their strength. They learned to thrive in the shadows of the creatures that had ended their reign. There's a kind of grace in that, isn't there? The quiet acceptance of change, the transformation of loss into adaptation. The giants that once filled the air had not been erased. They had been distilled. The air, now shared between predator and prey, had found its balance again. And as the birds soared higher, as bats mastered the night, as insects filled every remaining breath between, the sky finally reached equilibrium, a living reflection of the Earth's great rhythm. Give, take, adjust, and begin again. The world no longer remembered the age of giant insects, not consciously. But the memory remained in the structure of every wing that beats today, in the echo of every flight. Every time a bird rises into the air, it does so on the foundation laid by those ancient flyers who first taught the wind what it meant to carry life. The Carboniferous giants may have vanished, but they left behind the physics of possibility. And even now, as a sparrow cuts across the dawn, or a bat folds itself into dusk, the air still carries a trace of that memory, a soft vibration that says, this too once belonged to something older. The new rulers of the air did not erase the past. They completed it. The story of flight was never about who owned the sky, but who learned to listen to it. Every story, no matter how carefully told, eventually stumbles over an anomaly. Something that doesn't fit. A shadow in the record. A whisper out of sequence. For the tale of the giant insects, those anomalies lie in stone. Fossils that shouldn't exist. Wings too large for the air that was supposed to suffocate them. They appear in layers dated long after the Carboniferous, buried within epochs where oxygen levels had already fallen, where the laws of physics seemed to protest their presence. And yet, there they are, silent contradictions pressed into rock. To the scientists who study them, these fossils are both gift and challenge. Each one is a riddle written in carbon and pressure. Some show dragonfly wings wider than any modern species, delicate membranes preserved in impossible detail. Others depict beetles of improbable girth or millipedes that should have required an atmosphere richer than the one they inhabited. They are survivors, or perhaps echoes, fragments of a world that refused to stay buried. How could they exist? The conventional story says oxygen made the giants, and the loss of it unmade them. But these fossils whisper of something more complex, something the air alone cannot explain. Perhaps it was microclimate, small pockets of the world where conditions still mimicked the old abundance. Valleys where ancient plants clung to life, trapping moisture, exhaling just enough oxygen to sustain oversized wings. Or perhaps it was simply chance. Genetic memory expressing itself one last time before fading. Nature, after all, does not always obey its own averages. It experiments, quietly, endlessly, but some researchers suggest something stranger. They note that these oversized fossils often occur near geological boundaries, the edges of transitions, where ancient rock meets newer layers. Could it be that the dating itself is confused? That the layers have shifted, carrying older life upward into younger stone? Or is it that the boundary between epochs, like the boundary between life and extinction, is less clean than we imagine? In a way, these contradictions feel inevitable. Evolution, like history, is rarely tidy. The fossil record is a palimpsest, one age written over another, yet never completely erased. Each layer tells its own truth, But those truths overlap, blur, contradict. The result is not a line, but a haze. And in that haze, the improbable becomes possible. Still, for those who spend their lives studying stone, these anomalies feel personal. The idea that something enormous could survive unnoticed, that the story might be incomplete, invites both wonder and discomfort. Science prefers order. The fossils do not. Some of the most famous of these impossible specimens come from France and the Czech Republic. Massive insect wings dating to the early Permian, long after the Carboniferous had ended. Others have been unearthed in China and Kansas, each one defying the clean curves of atmospheric models. In these fragments, the giants seem to linger, haunting the edges of extinction like a dream that refuses to end. Maybe that's all they are. Dreams written in stone. But dreams, even fossilized, have power. They remind us that the past is not fixed, that our understanding of it is only as solid as the rock we're willing to question. Imagine unearthing one. The field around you quiet, the dust soft against your gloves. You brush away the last grains of sediment and see it. A lattice of wing veins, thin as silk, yet perfectly preserved. You measure it once, then again, and the numbers refuse to make sense. It's too big. The air of its time shouldn't have carried it. The textbooks say it shouldn't exist, but it does. And for a moment, the world feels larger than reason. Perhaps that feeling is the truest inheritance of the Carboniferous. Not the coal, not the oxygen, but the reminder that the planet once allowed impossibility. That nature, when unrestrained, builds not by rule, but by risk. There are other kinds of anomalies too. Fossils showing strange transitional forms, creatures halfway between giant ancestors and modern descendants. As if evolution itself hesitated, uncertain whether to let go. Their wings are mismatched, their bodies oversized but fragile, their proportions inconsistent with anything that thrives today. They look like drafts, not final versions. And maybe they were. The Earth, editing itself. These fossils also tell a subtler story, of persistence. Even as the world changed, the lineages of the giants did not vanish overnight. They contracted, splintered, adapted. The same genes that once built vast wings now built smaller ones. The code survived, if not the grandeur. Life is a master of repurposing. When the air no longer allowed scale, it turned to complexity instead. And yet, the presence of those few oversized forms after their supposed extinction complicates the narrative. It suggests that extinction too may be slower than we think. Not a single event, but a fading, a scattering of holdouts clinging to forgotten pockets of time. The world never changes all at once. It fractures, and in the cracks, old worlds linger. When we speak of extinction, we imagine finality. But fossils like these remind us that life does not end. It migrates. It retreats into corners, hides in valleys, reappears when we're not looking. Even now, in the deep ocean, in isolated jungles, in air pockets beneath the ice, there may be echoes of worlds we thought gone. Perhaps that's what these fossils really mean. Not that the giants returned, but that they never fully left. That some small part of the world kept breathing as if the Carboniferous had never ended. It's tempting to see symbolism in that, to imagine the Earth itself reluctant to forget. Maybe every age leaves a residue in the next, a trace of its atmosphere, a fragment of its creatures, a rhythm in its breathing. The planet doesn't erase, it layers. So when we find a fossil that shouldn't exist, maybe it isn't a mistake at all. Maybe it's the world reminding us that it never follows one path, that it keeps its own archives hidden in the folds of time. And when those anomalies surface, they do what the giants once did. They make us breathe differently. They force us to imagine that the limits we set for life are smaller than life itself. Because every fossil that breaks the rules is not just a window into the past. It's a mirror. It reflects how little we know, how much we still long to understand. The giants may be gone, but their traces still rise through stone, whispering of a world that was bigger, stranger, and more generous than ours. Perhaps deep down, that's what unsettles us most. The thought that the Earth could still be hiding something that doesn't fit. That even now, after all our measuring, it still holds its secrets. And in those secrets lies a quiet, haunting question. If the past can surprise us so completely, what might the future be hiding, just beneath the dust, waiting to be unearthed? In the end, not all extinction leaves a skeleton. Some vanishings occur inside the smallest vaults of life. In the blueprints, the codes, the chemical whispers that shape what a creature can be. Long after the last of the giant insects had turned to stone, something quieter was happening within their descendants. A kind of forgetting. A collapse not of wings or air, but of memory itself. Modern genetics, with its microscopes and data streams, allows us to look backward through that forgetting. Inside the DNA of every living insect lies a record of what it once was, a lineage of mutations, silences, and survivals. When scientists map those strands, they find gaps, long stretches where diversity once flourished and then suddenly stopped. These are the shadows of events we cannot see. Bottlenecks, collapses, silent purges, the marks of near extinction. It's strange to think that genes, like rocks, hold fossils too, not of bodies, but of possibilities. Within the genome of a modern dragonfly, you can trace the signature of an era when size was boundless, when oxygen made gods of insects. Then, abruptly, that signal fades. It's as if evolution itself took a deep breath and never finished exhaling. Researchers call these missing lines genetic bottlenecks, but the term feels too clinical for something so ghostly. What they really are is the sound of the past turning off. A switch flipped somewhere inside the story of life. The old versions of wings, the biochemical pathways that allowed gigantism, the respiratory genes tuned for dense air, all still exist, but dormant, like instruments with their strings cut. Why would evolution bury its own memory? Perhaps because the world no longer rewarded it. The genetic machinery that once sustained vast bodies became unnecessary, even dangerous, in thinner air. Mutations that favored smallness, efficiency, rapid reproduction. Those were the ones that survived. The genes for largeness, for slow and heavy forms, were left behind like obsolete architecture. Over millions of years, silence spread through the code. But there's something eerie about that silence. It suggests not just adaptation, but erasure. It's as though the Earth didn't simply change what lived on its surface, but reached inward, rewriting the very language of possibility. What once was physically impossible became biologically unthinkable. The planet had not only altered its air, it had altered the blueprint of those who breathed it. When biologists compare modern insect genomes, they find signs of multiple population crashes, episodes when diversity fell sharply, followed by long, slow recoveries. Some coincide with known environmental shifts, like the collapse of the coal forests or the volcanic winters that followed. But others have no visible cause. They appear in the data like heartbeats skipped in deep time. Something happened. Something not yet seen in the rocks. It's possible these collapses mark unseen extinctions, forgotten events where whole families of species dwindled without trace. Fossilization is rare. DNA, rarer still. Most life disappears not in explosions, but in whispers. Entire chapters of evolution can vanish in a handful of generations, leaving only faint genetic scars. The world moves on, unaware that a great silence has settled inside the code. That silence isn't uniform. In some lineages, pieces of the old potential remain, fossilized within DNA like ambered relics. Scientists have found dormant genes related to wing size and oxygen processing still embedded in the genomes of certain modern species. Dragonflies, beetles, even cockroaches. They are broken, inactive, but not gone. As though life, uncertain of its own future, chose to keep a copy of its old self just in case. It's a haunting thought that the memory of the giants still lives inside their descendants, waiting in molecular shadow. If the air were to change again, if oxygen rose once more to those ancient levels, could those genes awaken? Could the world remember how to make them? The answer, most likely, is no. The silence runs too deep now. The code has adapted to other pressures, other balances. To rewrite itself again would take millions of years, and by then the world would no longer be the same. But the question itself, the possibility that nature carries memory in her marrow, is what lingers. Some evolutionary biologists describe this as genetic echoing, the persistence of obsolete traits long after their use has vanished. In the wings of insects, in their nervous systems, in their eyes, remnants of gigantism remain like fingerprints on glass, not functional, but indelible. The Earth doesn't forget quickly, even when it wants to. There's another mystery in this silence, one more philosophical than scientific. If the planet's great transformations are mirrored in its DNA, then evolution is not just survival, but storytelling. Every mutation, every loss, is a line edited, a sentence rewritten. And when those lines fall quiet, the meaning shifts. The Earth, through its creatures, edits its autobiography in real time. Somewhere along the line, the insect's story changed from one of domination to one of endurance. Their genes, once tuned to a symphony of abundance, now hum a smaller, faster melody. They live shorter lives, but more of them. Weaker individually, but stronger as a whole. The silence that erased the giants gave birth to a chorus of the small. And yet, when you hold a dragonfly in your hand, if it allows it, you can still feel the ancient weight of that history. The fragility of its wings, the impossible precision of its motion. These are not accidents of modernity. They are the distilled perfection of an age when air was thick and time was slow. Inside that creature's tiny body is the residue of a world that once breathed more deeply than ours. It's easy to forget that extinction isn't an end, but a form of translation. The DNA of every living thing is written in the handwriting of everything that came before. Even silence leaves punctuation. The absence of certain genes is itself a kind of note, a pause that says, this is where something used to be. When scientists run their sequencing machines, when they translate the double helix into data, they are listening to that silence. The peaks and troughs of genetic variation form a rhythm, a waveform, like the sound of breath through time. The Carboniferous was the planet's deep inhale, the Permian, its long exhale. And within that exhale, the code of life rewrote itself to fit the new air. Now, hundreds of millions of years later, that same air fills our lungs. The same oxygen, recycled endlessly since the days of the giants, feeds our blood. Inside us, too, there are echoes, genes from ancient ancestors, silent but present, reminders that we are not apart from that story, but part of its ongoing revision. The genetic silence of the insects isn't just their story, it's ours. The same breath that built them builds us. The same planet that erased their excess sustains our fragility. The same balance that once collapsed could one day shift again. And if it does, if the air thickens, if the Earth exhales as it once did, maybe those buried codes will stir again. Maybe the world will remember its old proportions, and the sky will darken once more with impossible wings. Until then, the memory sleeps, not in fossils or rock, but in the silence that hums inside every cell. The last breath of an age is never loud. It fades, like wind retreating from the leaves it once loved. The Carboniferous had exhaled its final generosity, and the world entered a quieter phase of its long breathing. One that would last for millions of years, and would never again reach that same depth of abundance. The forests had vanished, the great wings had fallen, the air itself had changed its texture. The earth had learned restraint, but in that stillness, something lingers. The air we breathe now, the 21% oxygen that fills our lungs, the same gas that rusts metal and feeds flame, is not new. It is the same air that once flowed through the veins of dragonflies the size of birds. The same molecules, the same atomic breath. What's gone is not the oxygen, but the balance that once made it infinite. Today, scientists measure that breath with instruments that hum softly in sealed labs. They read its isotopic story, its delicate variations, and trace them back through time. They can see when the air thickened, when it thinned, when the forests rose and fell. They can see the Carboniferous inhale, the Permian exhale, the slow rhythm of planetary respiration. And in that curve, they can see us too. A new disturbance, a shallow spike rising too fast. We live within the planet's lungs, but we've forgotten how vast they are. The forests still breathe, though smaller now. The oceans still trade carbon for life, though heavier with heat and waste. The Earth's rhythm continues, but unsteady, like a heartbeat out of time. We have begun to quicken what was once slow, to compress what was once endless. In the silence after the giants, the Earth had rebuilt itself carefully. The oxygen stabilized, the fires calmed, evolution shifted towards subtlety. What the Carboniferous had created in excess, the Permian refined. The world became smaller, but wiser. Life learned precision, less grandeur, more complexity. And in that new balance, the air grew steady enough to sustain something delicate, something conscious. It would take hundreds of millions of years, but eventually, that same air would fill human lungs. When paleontologists hold a fossilized insect wing, they are holding a fragment of that shared inheritance. Every cell of that ancient creature once breathed the same element we do. The air is a library, an invisible archive. It holds the memory of everything that has ever lived. Oxygen turned to carbon, carbon turned to stone, stone turned to air again. The atmosphere is not empty. It's a record. If the forests of the Carboniferous gave us oxygen, then the giants gave us proportion. They were the planet's experiment in excess, a vision of what happens when balance is forgotten. Their rise and fall marked the beginning of a rhythm that still governs everything. The inhale of creation, the exhale of correction. And perhaps that's the most haunting part of their story. How familiar it feels. The same imbalance that built them, the same oversaturation of air, the same flooding of carbon and oxygen, echoes faintly in our own time. The fires that consume our forests today, the heat that ripples through our oceans, the thinning of breathable life, they are not new phenomena. They are repetitions, rehearsals, old songs sung again under new skies. The planet doesn't punish. It rebalances. Every rise demands a fall. Every breath, an exhale. When the Carboniferous filled the sky with oxygen, The Earth responded with flame. When we fill it now with carbon, it responds with heat. The language changes, but the meaning stays. There's a kind of mercy in this cycle. The Earth always finds equilibrium, even if we are no longer here to see it. It remembers how to correct itself. It knows how to forget abundance and return to calm. The question, perhaps, is whether we remember too, whether we can recognize the same rhythm repeating beneath the noise of our machines. In the still nights of that ancient world, before the last of the giants faded, the air must have carried a strange melancholy. The forests were thinning, the fires quieting. The dragonflies flew lower, their reflections broken across drying pools. Somewhere, an amphibian croaked into the silence. A small, rough voice echoing through a dying paradise. And yet even then, the world was not ending. It was becoming something else. That's the secret of extinction. It's never truly death. It's metamorphosis. The same atoms that once built the wings of Meganeura now form leaves, bones, clouds, us. The breath that filled their bodies still moves through the atmosphere, joining and rejoining the living. The world loses forms, not substance. Nothing here ever leaves. It only changes shape. If you stand in a dense forest today, any forest, anywhere, and breathe deeply, you're inhaling the residue of the Carboniferous, the coal we burn, the oxygen we depend on, the black dust in the air. They are the same materials, rearranged by time. We are breathing history. The air inside us is ancient, and yet, for all our awareness, we seem to be repeating the same forgetting. Our fires burn again. Our balance falters again. Our forests retreat again. We live inside a second Carboniferous, but one accelerated beyond comprehension. The Earth has inhaled once more, this time through us. Billions of lungs exhaling carbon faster than any forest can recover. The question that haunted the ancient world now turns toward us. How much breath can the planet hold before it exhales again? In the rocks that mark the end of the Carboniferous, the transition is almost imperceptible. No apocalypse, no boundary line, just a slow shift in chemistry, a thinning in color, a change in texture. The world doesn't collapse overnight. It fades. That is how balance is lost. Not in thunder, but in drift. We often imagine the giants as symbols of some distant prehistory, but their story is not far away. It's the story of breath itself, how easily it grows too rich, too poor, too uneven. The insects simply lived inside that imbalance until it consumed them. We are doing the same. The only difference is awareness, and even that feels fragile. Maybe someday, long after we're gone, someone else will read the air as we do now. They'll find layers of carbon, traces of plastic, a sudden spike in warming gases, the mark of our own abundance. And they'll call it something like the Anthropocene fire horizon, another breath, another correction. The Earth will have moved on, as it always does, slow and unbothered. But tonight, in the small hours when the air is still, we can still listen. The silence between our own breaths is the same silence that followed theirs. The pause between inhale and exhale, creation and erasure. In that pause lives the memory of every forest, every wing, every age that has ever tried to fly too high. The giants are gone, but their warning remains. Air is not a gift. It's a loan. And when we use it too freely, too completely, the planet remembers. It breathes in once more, and then, when it must, it breathes us out. So breathe softly, because somewhere, deep in that same air, the echo of their wings still stirs. A faint vibration, older than time, reminding us that even the sky has limits.